Hello and welcome to the Subjective Space with me, Sindhu Rajasekaran. Today's guest is Dr. Catriona Ellis. She is a historian and author. Thank you for joining me, Catriona. She is also
Wonderful to see you.
Thank you. She is also a teaching fellow at the University of Strathclyde, where she teaches health history. So let's start with the obvious question, Catriona, which is why you got interested in the Madras Presidency. So for people who are listening, Catriona's expertise is in the Madras Presidency in the late colonial period. So I'm just wondering why you got interested in that time period, in that particular space, because I'm from Madras. And then when I found out that, you're interested, I'm like, that's so rare because usually people are into Bengal or, some other thing, but why Madras?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in South Asian history, and my PhD was on the Madras Presidency, so very interested in the politics of the South. I think maybe starting from the point of view that I'm a Scot, and therefore I am maybe drawn to minority culture, and this idea of the Scots against London and the Dravidians against the North or Delhi or whatever was maybe a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
I find the South very interesting. I guess my second point was really what you referenced, this desire to provincialize Bengal.
Mm-hmm.
So even if I go to a conference now, I'm very often the only historian in Delhi who is speaking about the south of India.
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
still we talk about
yeah.
Bengal and we assume that Bengal means the whole of India.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't talk about Bengal, then we talk about Delhi, and we assume that that means the whole of India. And the south is just very different.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you brought that up, right? Because the Indian elections just happened, and one of the
Yeah,
places in India that completely rejected the BJP was Tamil Nadu. They got 0 seats. So it's a completely different culture in many senses, right? And the fact,
yeah.
like the Scots, and that's what draws me to Scotland too. Like I understand with the sort of Scottish pride because I'm Tamil and I get it. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about, because obviously your expertise is in the field of education and health,
Yeah.
right? And so looking at the historiographical debates surrounding education, especially in the colonial times in India, under the BJP and the RSS in India, there is this whole thing about how missionaries have, tried to convert, this whole history of how they have said, which is also partly true that they've said we are heathens. But there is also the other history. I wanted to tell you a little story before say
Yeah.
why I'm interested in all of this
Yeah.
is that I have intercaste a family
Yeah.
background, and I have Dalit ancestry too. So my Dalit great grandfather was a tea plantation worker, and
Yeah.
my grandfather, so they did not have money to send their kids to school or whatever, and obviously because of caste they were not allowed to study. But my grandfather was given free education by a missionary school.
Yeah.
They had a perdition hostel where he was fed, clothed,
Yeah.
educated, and that's how they got out of poverty. And this is where I am today. So there is
Yeah.
this very complex colonial history, which is not talked about in that sense. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about that, your approach to researching and writing this history, and how you look at sort of caste, class, race, gender, and all of those things in the colonial period.
So before we do that, can I go back to the Dravidian context
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
a little bit longer, just because I think it's maybe important for your listeners to understand just how different the Dravidian context is. I know many of your listeners will be South Asian, but even there, they're not getting a sense, I think, often of how different the literary and linguistic background is. But it's not just about language. It's not just that Tamil Nadu, Kerala have got different linguistic roots. It's also their approaches to education, but
Mm-hmm.
also their transnational links. So I think that's not the Theosophical movement, for example, is completely bypassing the North
Mm-hmm.
and having links to Europe. So I think the transnational history of the south of India is interesting
Mm-hmm.
because it's based around the Indian Ocean, because it is based around different intellectual movements. than the North has as well, and things don't need to go through Delhi and they don't need to go through London to be interesting. And I think that's interesting. I think the colonial structures are different.
Mm,
So the very different land revenue system, and that has different um, implications too, in terms
mm,
of education and how education is funded, but also in terms of the politics. So I think the
mm,
rise of the Dravidian parties, and that's where you reference with the DMK, their recent success,
mm,
their complete rejection of the BJP, despite quite a lot of attempts to
yes.
to
Yeah.
and which has been stunning really over
Yeah.
the last 2 days. And so seeing that roots in the Justice Party or the
Mm-hmm.
non-Brahmin Party, which is of course a landowning party, it's a coalition of interests. It
Mm-hmm.
does become more radical in the 1930s, but this is not a story, even in terms of nationalist politics, about the Congress Party.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just really interesting. And I
Yeah.
think it's interesting that the people I'm working on, because they have access to power in the 1920s, are not from the Congress Party.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And um, that is that just they think differently,
Mm-hmm.
and they approach the British differently,
Yeah,
and
I think
so that
that's the key element too.
yeah,
How these it's not it's in these sort of colonial setups, Obviously, these people
yeah,
are interacting with the colonists, and they
yes,
are forming alliances. They're negotiating. There are lots of compromises being made. Who
yes,
is associating and aligning with who, and what's the
yeah,
purpose? What's the agenda? Right. So what you're saying is that's very important. The transnational links you're talking about
I
predating
think so.
even this colonial history, or even predating the
Yes.
Mughals, predating everything that we think is Indian history, right? So that really makes the difference. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Tell me how you approach this, because you've written so many papers and books about these topics. So when you approach this, what are the sort of registers, or what are you looking at? How do you approach it?
So, so I'm interested, particularly in the 1920s and 30s. So I'm interested in who's writing. I'm interested in who's inhabiting the political space, who's writing in the newspapers, and what the links of organisations are. So what
Mm-hmm.
I've discovered is a lot of my work is centered around the League of Nations and other international, because I'm looking at childhood, international humanitarian organisations, because they are directly communicating with people in Madras, and they're communicating with people from the Justice Party or just social reformers or people who are associated with the Theosophical movement. Or they're just communicating very differently, and there are letters and there's interactions and there's interventions at the League of Nations, and so the sources are different
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
from often we'd look at in the north. And for me, I'm mainly looking at state policy, so I'm interested in the municipal council in Madras, in the to some extent in Coimbatore as well,
Mm-hmm.
and then in the Madras Legislative Council.
Mhm. Which is
So
so
that's
which is so interesting to me, because I grew up in Madras, right? And these are
yeah,
like institutions that I grew up around,
yes,
and to know that you've researched all of this. So tell me about snapshots of the classroom, right? Which you look at from starting from 1882, where you look at
yeah.
autobiographical accounts, which you just mentioned, the letters that have been passed around, or other element. What are these autobiographical accounts? Are they books? Are they based on letters? What is it? That's one of the questions I have about the sources that you mentioned. What is that, and why does the sort of history? I think I have so many questions in this thing, but I'll ask you little by little. But
Yeah.
just to know what interests you about these sort of subjectivities, or these people's individual viewpoints, right? Rather than looking at it as a sort of larger, more general history of education or health or whatever. Why are you more interested in these sort of subjective viewpoints?
So I think I'm essentially a historian of childhood and children. And so I was really interested in finding sources where you get some element of children's voice. I think that's problematic. I think you have to be very careful how you read the sources, but it started from a perception of colonial history, which is all about what the state wants, what reformers want, what adults want to do to children.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started from a point of view, okay, I want to understand what children think about their education. How do I access that? Children in the past, that is very difficult. Therefore, I will look at autobiographies as a not perfect source, but as the beginnings of a source to look at that. And so to look at the personal experience gives a different perspective than a curriculum document, which says children will learn this. And the children who are writing about it, or the adults who are writing about their remembered childhoods, are saying, but actually we drew on the blackboard. We drew caricatures on the blackboard, or we fought whenever the teacher left the room. And it gives a very different flavour of what education looked like. So I look at the memoirs of 55 individuals. They're all born between 1910 and 1940. 8 of them are Dalit or Adivasi. The vast majority are Brahmin, so I think we can see the upper caste dominance. 9 of them are from women. So I think you get perspectives of different groupings that you wouldn't necessarily see in the usual source material. So from looking at that source, one of the assumptions that I would challenge is that when you look at the official documents, you're talking about boys' education. Actually, all the girls go to boys' schools. They don't have separate curriculum. They don't have. This is not about education for domesticity. These are actually got girls and boys. The boys remember girls in their classroom. The girls remember being in with the boys. So this idea of girls only schooling is a nice myth that the officials want to tell themselves, but it isn't reflected in who is just inhabiting the classroom.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that makes sense because, it must have been pretty fluid. Like you just allow whoever's coming to school, right?
Yeah, you don't turn them away if they're happy to be there. I think that's quite interesting. So that's the extra richness that can give. I mean, I guess just before you jump in, I also think this is also about South Indian autobiographies, which are very different from Western or Bengali ones. This is autobiographies used to, they talk in terms of excising the self. It was K. Satanatan talks about snapshots from a person in a boat moving along the river of Indian history. They're seeing themselves as reflecting the socio-economic times that they're in and reflecting their context. They're not talking about themselves, their individual journey, their own self reflexivity. They're almost deliberately not doing that. And a number of historians have written about that, how that's a distinctively South Indian register as well. So
That is
they're
very
writing
interesting.
social history.
That is so interesting. So tell me some more things that surprised you and interested you that you came across in these accounts. This is something that's, because they're looking at themselves as citizens or sort of like of the world. I don't know of what, and when they're looking at, where do you think they belong? Are they putting themselves as citizens of the empire, as citizens of India? How are they looking at themselves?
I think they're thinking of themselves as members of their family. And they're not really interested in recording what they learned, but they're interested in recording who they played with and what the experience of schooling was for them. And I think that is interesting. Where you do get is adult bias, really. There are a number of educational reformers who use their autobiographies as a way of promoting a political cause in the 1960s or 70s as they're being published. And so you always have to aim off for that. But often what they're talking about how much fun they're having. And I'd say a lot of the upper caste autobiographies talk about their moments of surprise when they think back and realise the caste discrimination that they themselves perpetuated and didn't realise. And now as adults they're thinking, actually that was terrible, that I was the only person who had a seat in the classroom,
Mm,
or we got extra gifts. I didn't question it at the time,
mm-hmm, mm,
but looking back, why did I accept that?
yeah. I'm
That's
glad that they at least acknowledge that. Yeah.
yeah, and they
Mm,
almost use their autobiography to think through some of those questions.
mm-hmm,
I suppose the Dalit autobiographies were particularly interesting
mm-hmm,
because for many of them, they were in their own communities, and then school became the place where they faced the fact that they were different.
mm,
And so they almost learned how to be a Dalit of whichever group
mm,
as they went into that educational space.
mm. It
And
sort
then
of makes a
discuss their
difference. Yeah.
pain. And so
Mm,
you get that experience of I'm writing to represent a community, not just for myself.
mm,
And
mm.
you can evoke pain and you can evoke resistance for a community through personal memories that you can't through other genres, I think.
Mm-hmm. That is so true, and that is so interesting, right? Because, like as you say, when you said that these people write from the point of view of the families they belong to, because that's the smallest social structure they're part of, and
Yeah,
then they're coming into the world and sort of interacting with these people, like, oh, this is where I
yeah,
fit in, or this is where I am at in this hierarchy of whatever it is. So let's talk a little bit about, Madras presidency specifically, because I have
yeah,
questions obviously about the
yeah,
Madras presidency. So your work is about pre-independent India. You look at a lot of policies around India, but you're more
yeah,
specific. Your expertise really is in Madras presidency, right? If
yeah,
I'm not wrong.
yeah,
Okay, so, perfect. So one of the other things I wanted to ask you about was with respect to food and health, right? Sort of they come together at one point. So I
yeah,
wanted to ask you about, in general, the state intervention into the lives of poor kids in
yeah,
India. This is in pre-independent India, so the colonial government, but with a lot of natives or Indians in the government, a part of that corporation or whatever it was,
yeah,
and also about the sort of compulsory education in the Madras presidency. So, was that something that was common across all presidencies in
yeah.
India? Did they all have this compulsory education plus intervening for to feed poor kids? Was that common around all of them, or was it
Yeah.
specific?
So the intervention to feed poor children was specific to Madras,
Interesting.
particularly Madras Municipal Council. So
Mm-hmm.
it seems to be very specific to the south, and of course that's where we see later developments in feeding children
Yeah.
come from the south as well.
Mm-hmm.
There is a more general move to compulsory education. So Gokhale, his bill is defeated in 1913, 11,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere around there, and we have after the war, the First World War, we have a number of bills passed
Mm-hmm.
in a number of the presidencies. The Madras presidency is distinctive in that it takes the structures that are used in in Britain
Mm-hmm.
and uses those structures. So we have the 1902 Balfour Act in England, and they structure education provision around educational councils, so local areas managing their own. It's a decentralised model of education provision, and
Mm-hmm.
that bill is transferred almost directly to Madras. So we
Mm-hmm.
have these
Oh.
district educational councils for 20 years who manage education provision, who manage taxation, who manage the implementation of compulsory education, and we don't have that anywhere else in India.
Mm.
So
That
there
is so
is,
fascinating. Yeah.
yeah. So there's compulsory education is happening, but it's happening in a different form.
Mm.
And I
So,
think it's because this is a self-confident elite who are taking what they want from the British, but they're also taking what they want from other presidencies. At one point, they say, "Oh, the Punjabis do this quite well. Oh,
mhm.
we'll follow
Yeah.
them."
Yeah.
So they are sufficiently well educated and they're sufficiently well networked.
Mm-hmm.
Education networks, New Education Fellowship, for example, which is based in New York, that actually they feel that they can prove their modernity by
Mm-hmm.
taking what they want from the British, but also from other places.
Mm-hmm.
And
That
that's
is
and
very, that
and
is, yeah.
And they do, and these, like in all the debates, are like, we want to do compulsory education first so that we're better than the rest of India. Like they actually say, in the eyes of our brother
Yeah.
corporations,
And
they're
and you
so
must have
determined to be best.
gone through all of those discussions they had and everything, right? What did the minutes of those
Yeah.
meetings, and like what did they talk about? Right.
Yeah, so all their debates, and a lot of them are saying we need to do this first
Yeah, yeah.
because
That is so
we can prove.
interesting.
Yeah. I guess another point that I maybe want to pick up on from what you said was, this is not a colonial idea.
Mm,
So what we have in 1919 is a Government of India Act, and that
mm,
devolves power to the presidency, to the
mm,
presidencies over non-important areas. And of course,
mm,
non-important areas mean areas that children, where we find children,
mm,
so education and health,
mhm, mhm,
and juvenile justice. So
mhm,
what we have is these policies, in compulsory education and nutrition, are introduced by educated Indians.
mhm,
This
mm,
is They are elected in a very limited franchise,
mhm, mm,
undoubtedly. This is
mhm.
not democracy, but
Yeah.
it is majority Indians, are the officials, or majority Indians who are in the corporation and in the Legislative Council. We see
Mhm,
very, very few British voices.
mhm, mhm,
They rubber stamp it. They don't. So I think this is very distinctive.
mhm,
And why I think this is distinctive is it starts a social policy idea.
mhm,
It starts a form of a new state, which is Indian.
mhm,
And that's why I don't think in areas like education, 1947 and independence is such a great turning point,
mm.
because I think a lot of these structures just continue.
Mm. So this is somewhere
Um,
I wanted to also dig into your brain a little bit more
yeah,
about these concepts of, you discuss modernity, which is very interesting to
mm,
me, which is like I'm obsessed with that. So
yeah,
when did modernity happen? What was that? So
yeah,
these notions of a modern childhood, because we know how
yeah,
even children were treated in Victorian England, right? It's
yeah,
not like they were treated, it was quite harsh. So to
yeah.
see this sort of universalized notion of modern childhood, when did that happen globally, do you think? And when did and was it a need for these Indians in the Madras Presidency, or these Tamil people or mixed Dravidians in the Madras
Yeah,
Presidency, who we can't, because they're not all Tamil, they're Telugu, they're Malayali, they're all of
yeah,
those things in the
yeah,
Madras Presidency as well.
yeah.
So these people wanted to be part of this modern universal idea
Yes.
of whatever that was. So can you explain that a bit?
So I think this idea of modern childhood
Mm-hmm.
emerges in India in the 1920s, and that's partly why I'm interested in that decade, particularly among the middle classes,
Mm-hmm.
or those who are and have positions of authority. I think it has emerged slightly earlier in the West, um, in but it is really encapsulated in 1924 in the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which
Mm-hmm.
sets out, this is what um, these are the key requirements that a modern state should provide for children,
Mm-hmm.
but also that mankind owes the child the best it has to give. That there's a
Mm-hmm.
requirement on adults to do something for
Mm-hmm.
children. And so I think that is the first real international standard for children.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, children become, I mean, it's Dominic Marshall who says they become a focus of global diplomacy after that. You can have equality between areas because everyone is a child under the age of 18.
Mm-hmm.
That's So I think we see these ideas emerging in the 1920s. That's
Mm-hmm.
not to say they have popular currency, but they're
Mm-hmm.
informing state practice.
Mm-hmm.
And that is interesting. And so they become a means of governance. You govern because the child has boundaries which are defined by age.
Mm-hmm.
And that is in the case of education and nutrition, but also the Child Marriage Restraint Act later on. And in terms of sexuality as well. There's
Mm-hmm.
now an age which is
Mm-hmm.
assumed to be global, and it often occurs in the context of discourses around trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
because you need to have equality across borders.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a universal idea which becomes more popular. It
Mm-hmm.
informs modern forms of governance. So we must provide education for children because they are our future citizens.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also a form of ideological opposition to the British.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the child is universal, if all children are the same and require the same treatment, then that means that British children and Indian children are the same.
Yeah.
And so by claiming universality, I think they're undercutting the racial hierarchies
Hmm.
of late colonial governmentality. I think that's fascinating.
Mhm. Yeah, it is.
So,
And that's another question I had for you, right? About envisioning these children as future citizens and
yeah.
and universalizing that. So in the Madras presidency, when you see this as in the policy that people are making, when they're looking at these people as future citizens, what does that mean exactly? Like, is this a very nationalistic thing that's going on, or is it more to do, how do you see this?
So it has to be a bit nationalistic. It has to be
Mm.
with the prospect of an independent India
Mm-hmm.
in the future. And I think they genuinely believe that that will happen
Mm,
in subsequent generations. And they're working towards that, whether that is a Dravidian
mm,
area or whether that is the whole of India, that doesn't really matter.
mhm,
But I think to be a citizen, you need to vote and you need
mm,
to pay your taxes. And actually, I think that's what they're really interested in. So they want
mm.
to have people who are basically literate and numerate,
Yeah,
who can vote with some degree of knowledge
mm,
when they become adults and can pay their taxes and can
yeah,
understand time discipline. They can show up on time for work and they can leave work
mhm,
and they know how to lead what the state thinks are moral lives. That
mhm,
is what they're interested in their future citizens rather than
yeah,
thinking of them as future Indians necessarily.
yeah. There is the whole aspect of how the moral policing that went with a lot of
Yeah.
these sort of things, which I won't get into right now because that's outside the scope of this discussion.
Yeah.
But there is that box of Pandora's box to open. But anyway, coming back to the children's autobiographies that you read, not children's in the sense that they wrote when they're older, the
Yeah.
memoirs, the autobiographies, and all of those things. Uh, what were the aspirations of these people at that time, as these children, like because obviously the policymakers are looking at, okay, these people are the future citizens and they're going to pay taxes, they have to do this and or
Yeah.
whatever. But how do these people see themselves also? You spoke
Yeah.
about social identity a little bit, but a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So to have written their autobiographies, almost all of them are literate, and
Mm,
therefore almost all of them have been to secondary school,
mm-hmm,
and therefore they are not representative of their peers. And so they are the ones in the village school, and they talk about the village school a lot. And then
mm-hmm,
they move to the secondary school, and that is where they get their education, and that is where they become modern, and they have left everyone else behind.
mm-hmm,
And I think that is important to their ideas of self-identity and
mm-hmm,
where they're going in life. I'm not sure that
mm-hmm.
answered your question. Maybe you should ask me the question again.
No, I'm just
Yeah.
wondering about, like, did they have specific aspirations? Like, I want to become a doctor or an engineer, or like, like specific things, like what they saw themselves as, what would they become, because that's so common in middle class India now, right? Because everybody wants to be a doctor.
Yeah.
Right? That's the thing of education. So I'm just wondering what those people aspired to be. Did they want to be employed by the government? Was that the ultimate, aim?
So most of them go into education. So
Mm.
they see themselves as future university lecturers or future teachers, I
Ah,
think. I think it's
okay.
teaching. I think teaching is where modern teaching. So they
Hmm.
all talk about the traditional teacher versus the modern teacher,
Ah,
and
I
they are
see.
interested in becoming the modern teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a beginning aim. There is not a huge emphasis on studying medicine. I
Mm-hmm.
guess that the best one is APJ Abdul Kalam's. autobiography, because of course he's from this area in this time
Yeah.
period, and he of course always wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. After
Yeah.
he saw ducks flying, he went to a school trip, he saw
Yeah.
ducks flying, he wanted to understand how flying worked, and that was
Yeah.
his inevitable progress. And that is
Mhm.
where autobiography is a problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
people rewrite history according
Yeah.
to where they ended up, and so if most of the people I'm reading are educators or librarians, then that
Yeah.
is what they're writing, or politicians. That's what
Mm.
they're writing about.
Memory is very porous, right? So they're just gonna add on things and just,
Yeah.
that makes sense. So I want to go back a little bit
Mm.
to health and nutrition,
Yeah.
and talk about that a little bit more, because obviously, my research is all about the famine of 1877. So I'm
Yeah.
all about what happened then, and the famine, and what was not done to save all of these people who could have been living
Yes.
otherwise. But there's a radical shift after all of these famines in how it's the whole thing is looked at, right? But especially in the Madras Presidency, they have these midday meal schemes.
Yeah.
That start off, and so this is another thing I wanted to find out. And we also spoke about the Geneva Declaration of 1924, which you'd mentioned, I think, earlier as
Mm.
well. So this commitment to sort of having people fed,
Yeah.
especially children, to understand that poverty a lot of times is that they don't get education. They need to be able to eat to be able to come to
Yeah.
school. It's like it goes hand in hand. So is this something that comes up in the sort of nationalist debate, or is this something the British pass policies on? How did this sort of happen?
So I don't think there's much British intervention at all.
Mm-hmm.
This is happening in debates in particularly Madras Municipal Council, and
Mm-hmm.
it is introduced by the Justice Party, who introduce it as part of their educational policies.
Mm-hmm.
That is very much on the basis, if you cannot feed the body of a child, you can't feed their brain. So this idea that you need to have nutrition, we're not providing food, we're providing nutrition so that they can learn, because children should be learners. And I think that progress is important in terms of how, so they're feeding learners, they're not feeding poor children, although inevitably they are feeding the children who they regard to be the poorest and who need that nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
It is introduced by the Justice Party, and it is supported by the Congress Party, and it is supported across the parties until it ends in 1942.
Mm-hmm.
And it ends as the compulsory education scheme collapses because of the impact of the war, and the fear of the Japanese invasion, and everything kind of collapses in Madras at that point. And so there is no opposition to it. The only people, they discuss what the children should be fed.
What did they
So
say?
they say, so don't feed them like British children, don't feed them bread. What
Yeah.
kind of rice do they want? There's a
Yeah.
huge fear of adulteration.
Mm.
There's a lot of discussion about curds and what is nutritious food.
Mm.
And there's a lot of discussion, even in the council, about the logistics.
Oh, I
So,
see.
like, where there's 2 feeding centres, how should the meals be distributed?
Yeah.
But the basic concept of we should feed children because they'll learn better isn't disputed at all. And I think
That's
that's
interesting.
interesting. I think
Yeah.
we have this consensual space around children between, these are all Indian
Mm.
parties, the
Mm.
Swaraj Party, the Congress Party, the Justice Party. They're all contributing, but they're not scoring political points.
Mm.
Whereas on other
Yeah.
aspects,
Mm.
Gandhian education, they're quite happy to disagree quite vociferously. But
Mm.
in this area, I think they are um, they're relatively agreed. I mean, I think in all these social policies, what's interesting is these are catered for poor children.
Mm.
Poor children is what
Mm.
they're called, but
Mm.
there's no discussion of caste.
I was going to
So
ask you about that next.
there's no discussion
Yeah.
or what is appropriate for different
Mm.
castes of
Mm.
children, I think they're all fed as if they're Brahmins, as far as I can
I
work
was just going
out.
to ask you, was there meat in
No,
the midday meal? Not even eggs.
I don't think there was egg. No, I don't think there
Mm.
was. So
Okay.
that is interesting.
Hmm.
They're not making any they're not making any distinction. And that is why one of my arguments in my book is
Hmm.
that although they're talking about the universal child,
Hmm.
all children are the same, when they implement policies, the child is male, the child is upper caste, the child is rich, the
Hmm.
child is able-bodied,
Hmm.
um, the child is Tamil speaking.
Hmm.
They really don't cater for Telugu children very well at all.
Hmm.
And so they're not interested in non-Tamil speaking children. And
Really?
that is interesting. So they
Hmm.
have in their head an ideal child.
Hmm. They have
And
their
that
own
isn't
ethno-nationalistic agendas going
they
on as well.
do.
Yeah.
And that imagined child is not actually the child who's receiving free school meals.
That's interesting because even recently, there was this big thing in India, this debate about whether eggs should be introduced, and it should be taken away because it's non-veg food,
Yeah.
because stuff like that. But this is so interesting. So
Mhm.
the ideal thing was everybody was fed, or not everybody, all these ideal type
Yeah.
of they were fed this particular meal.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And
Oh.
about 5,000 of them were fed.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
not insignificant numbers,
Mm-hmm.
although
Mm.
it's very small compared to the
Yeah.
numbers which are. And I just think it's fascinating. I can't find it happening anywhere else in India
Mm-hmm.
that the state, the local government are committing significant resources
Mm.
to feeding children. And
Mm-hmm.
it does lead to a competition with the local legislative council.
Mm-hmm.
So for the whole of the presidency, because as to whether this is a health or an education measure,
It's
and which
conflicting,
budget it
like,
should come from,
yeah,
basically.
yeah. They're just worried about budgets, of course.
Yeah.
Why do you consider this a significant departure in the history of children and the Indian welfare state? Because that's something important, right? Because India becomes a welfare state after independence. That's what
Yes.
it's supposed to be, at least on paper. So it becomes this welfare state. So what changed?
So what I think is important is that this welfare state doesn't happen after 1947.
Mm,
It happens before then.
mm,
And it is built on the work of these legislators who are introducing juvenile justice.
mm,
They're introducing so the Children's Act. They're introducing education. They're introducing feeding, nutrition, and they're building up state practices and state institutions around this,
mm,
which then continue.
mm,
So they have accepted the principle that the state has responsibility for children who can't afford to feed themselves or clothe themselves.
mm,
And I think that's interesting. That I think that's a significant departure. And
mm.
I think it happens because Indians are in power, not because the British are in power.
Mm. It's very
Um,
interesting because growing up in Madras, all these
yeah,
institutions still run these policies, and some of these
yeah,
policies are so old, and they still have them for some reason, sometimes. And so it's really interesting to see how these things came about and how, like you said,
yeah,
because a lot of people have this illusion that all of these things constituted in the Madras Presidency was by the British, but like you were explaining how it was a lot of times it was these sort of local parties that came
yes,
up with these policies,
yeah.
which is very interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
and maybe I should say not just the parties in parliament, but
Mm,
also social reformers. So
mm,
we have the Theosophical Society, or we have the Women's India
mm,
Association, which is
mhm,
based in Madras, or we have the Madras Children's Aid Society. We have
mm,
a well networked group
mm,
of fairly rich, middle class, well educated men and women, a lot of women participating, who
mhm,
are driving policy and who are frequently, I mean, that's where the letters come from.
mm.
They're writing to the government and saying, you said you'd introduce compulsory education and you haven't.
Yeah, yeah.
You said you'd introduce juvenile courts and you haven't. Why not? We will
Mm,
help.
mhm,
And so these are the people who are also informing policy. And
mhm,
again, they're predominantly Indian.
Mhm. That's very interesting too. All these sort
Mm.
of non-governmental
Yes,
institutions, people, activists, writers, all of these people who are
absolutely.
pushing the agenda forward, which is brilliant. Okay,
Yes.
this is great. I can sit and talk to you about the Madras Presidency for hours.
Forever.
Obviously, I have so many questions outside of what I said. I'll ask you, but as the last thing, I must ask you about not related to your health or education, but about some Madras Presidency gossip from the time period that we both like.
Yeah.
It's the murder of Clement de la Haye. So can you just tell me what happened and just the story of what happened? Because when you told me about this, I was like, what? And then I was researching it. I was so fat. I'm like, this is a great movie waiting to be made.
Exactly.
So
So I
tell
think
me.
between us, we should have a Netflix series or something. But
Yeah.
this is the joy of archival research, is that you're sitting in the archives, you're looking for records of individual schools, and one of them says not accessible murder case. I think it's murder in Newington School, and you're like, well, I have to read this now, don't I?
Yeah.
That is the joy of being in the archives when you've
Yeah.
looked at education finance for
Yeah.
days. And so what happens is we have a school for the zamindars. There's not very many of them in the south of the country. Sorry, my phone just flashed a message. Um, and um, they have, it's like the Rajkumar colleges. So
Mhm.
they are Indian young people, teenagers. They have a British headmaster, Clement de la Haye,
Mhm.
and he is meant to give them a good education. He actually teaches them riding and shooting and cricket. He's
Mhm.
very into cricket. So that's clearly what is a princely education. They don't
Yeah.
learn much. They all fail their exams, but they know how to play cricket and they know
Yeah.
how to shoot, which is important. And
Which is still true.
and exactly. And one night they apparently one of the boys, probably about 17, the one who's accused, murders the headmaster, shoots him through the head while he's sleeping beside his wife and baby.
Oh my God.
Um, which is and he is accused. All the police come quickly. They're all interviewed. Their stories don't match up as far as I can tell.
Mhm.
And the accused, it becomes a big scandal that is eventually moved to Bombay, to the High Court there,
Mhm.
and the accused is acquitted. So there's
Mhm.
two accused, one turns king's evidence,
Mhm.
but the person in the dock is acquitted, and his biggest supporter is the wife of the British judge. I mean, it's a bizarre story, um, and
And this has
and there's
nothing
so
to
many
do with
twists.
there's nothing to do with nationalism or anything. It's not motivated by like let's kill the British. It's none of that. It's a personal. Um, this it that's what it
Honestly,
is.
I don't know. I still really don't know who committed the murder. I've
Hmm.
looked at the court transcripts, I've talked to other people who worked on it. None of us can work it out. We all
Hmm.
start with the idea that we will. We don't know. We do know that he was racist. We do know that he called them barbarous civilians,
Hmm.
and that is meant to be the cause for murder.
Hmm.
But there's no, and we do know that he stopped the accused from going to college, which
Hmm.
he'd wanted to pursue a college course,
Hmm.
and he wasn't allowed to.
Hmm.
Um, but more than that, we don't know. In the course of the trial,
Hmm.
all kinds of gossip comes out.
Can
So
we
the
hear some?
wife, who's much younger, obviously, is sent back to Britain almost immediately. And so
Hmm.
and then in the course of the trial, there comes out all kinds of accusations, like the young men are sleeping with the headmaster's wife, who's British. This is scandalous. They're
Hmm.
sleeping with each other. They frequently hire in sex workers. It becomes like a teenage drama of what is going on in this colonial institution.
Yeah.
And I think the
Mm.
British are just so embarrassed
Yeah.
that they
Oh.
just want to close down. But I just think It's a
Yeah.
fabulous story.
Yeah, I mean it is, and that's the truth of it, right? Because this is what I'm always interested in as well. You're a
Yeah,
historian, and because when the British first came to India, right, they were constantly marrying
yeah,
women from India. It was
yeah,
very common. Obviously they were falling in love with them. Obviously they were getting married. They were having
yeah,
kids. But at some point, all of this stopped, and it was considered to be like completely not okay. Like you can't. This
yeah,
is not allowed, like because of the racist hierarchies that
yeah,
obviously. So
yeah.
the fact that it was still happening when Clevendale maybe happened
Yes,
in the school, that fascinates me. I'm like, because it's the most natural, normal thing that can happen when people live together. you
yes.
know, it
And
is,
and and so there's all things about this young pretty wife and the
yeah,
older
yeah,
man, and
yeah.
there's all
And she sent back
and it's
immediately.
she's sent back, so she and her family still vigorously defend her and defend
mm,
her honor. That's
yeah.
also interesting.
Mm,
And I suspect it is an outsider who commits a crime,
mm,
and they're trying to close down the college.
mm,
And I think it's linked to wider politics around closing down the funding for the college.
mm. Oh my
But
God, this is like a
it,
whole Netflix series.
it absolutely is. And you could add a few extra bits and it would just be a scandal.
Yeah, it's like it's.
And it's just interesting. This is someone who, an Indian,
Mhm,
almost certainly, murders the British headmaster in 1919, and nobody is ever convicted. That is actually astonishing.
mm,
Like, the British establishment must have really not liked him, or
yeah.
must have really wanted to keep these tales of interracial sex out of the
Yeah.
college. To be
Yeah.
honest, can't see any other reason.
Yeah, yeah, that makes total sense to me, right? Because
Yeah.
that's what they want to cover up. Because that, from what I've understood by researching in the archives for
Mhm.
so long,
Yeah.
is that a lot of things about India really scandalize British. They do not want like those
Yep.
stories coming out, and like same-sex love, interracial love, love in any form which is outside of
Yep.
marriage. All of that is like
Yeah.
really scandalous stuff. So
Yeah.
yeah, but this is honestly, you should tell me more such stories. We will collaborate separately on that.
Yes. Absolutely.
But thank you so much, Katrina. This was great talking to you. And I think a lot of South Asian enthusiasts and Madras Presidency enthusiasts in particular would have learned a lot from listening to you. So people listening to this podcast, please go read Katrina's work. She's written so many books and so many papers on all of the stuff that she has talked about. So thanks, Katrina.
Thanks for the opportunity to share. It's been a great conversation.